Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you all here at the African Study Center for our conference and our seminar on decolonization. It's a pleasure in particular to welcome Wayne Modest, who has been for some time already in the Netherlands and who we know very well. Actually, I met him in the conference last month on heritage and Africa. Wayne is a cultural studies scholar who has been working in the Royal Tropical Museum in Amsterdam, now part of the Netherlands Museum of World Cultures, which is the overall organization of all major ethnographic museums in the Netherlands. In these days, we have a general debate about our history, and our history has become very hot topic. We have always been raised on the notion that our national ancestors were heroes, etc. And now we are learning that at least partly they were villains. And that's a shift we are making. We are now in a culture where people are canceling history, which is not exactly what we intend to do here, I hope. Anyway, one of the leading figures in that whole debate on what should ethnological museums do, what should they be, is indeed Wayne Modest, and he just recently published a book on the ways of belonging of objects. I know that museums have been self-searching, soul-searching, navel-gazing, however you want to call it, for a long time. And he has been one of the major exponents in this whole thing of rethinking your own identity as a museum of someone else, and viewing his large credentials and his commitment to this very decolonization cause. It is my pleasure to introduce Wayne Modest.
I'm sorry for being late. I was downstairs trying to find my way. Actually, when I came in, there was a 123, 125, and I couldn't know where 122 was. And then when I reached it, it was there, and it was the wrong one. So that didn't help me. I don't know how many people you expect and what kind of discussions you want to have here. If anything else, over the next, this is going to be a conversation. So I have a kind of lecture. I always find that my lectures are so, when I write them, they are so boring that I can't keep to them anymore. So we're going to have a conversation. And I want to start out by doing two things. First of all, we're going to talk about what decolonization is, the conceptual category of decolonization and why decolonize. So that's one thing we're going to do. But I actually want to start out with one corrective. In a certain sense, one of the books that have inspired me recently is this book by Michael Rothberg. And it's a book that is called The Implicated Subject, where Rothberg, having written an earlier book, which was important in memory studies, a memory studies scholar, trauma studies, memory studies scholar, literary studies scholar, and his first book was about multidirectional memory, to try and think through, you could say, Holocaust memory and colonial memory together. But in this new book, he wanted to do something else. He wanted to try and understand the current moment and how we come to terms with our own relationship with difficult histories and difficult pasts, with racist past and racist present. And just for you to know, I am going to use the word racism a lot, discrimination a lot, because I think that one of the issues with our disciplines is that disciplinarily, we've not come to terms with the question of race enough. because many disciplines shy away from it as an analytical starting point. So if you think of memory studies, heritage studies, museum studies, they don't know yet how to come to terms with the question of race. And that haunts a lot of the things that we do. But Rothberg's notion of the implicated subject was exactly because he found it difficult, especially in this moment, to try and understand your relationship with a past that you cannot remember, really, with a past that you cannot say you did anything in because you were too young. I'm presuming you're young, forgive me. That you were not there at the time. But still, you are a part of the present that that past has formed. And he was a little bit tired or struggled with the conventional notion of bystander, victim, or perpetrator. And he was trying to think through, what does it mean to live in the inheritance of difficult past, and how do we relate with those pasts? If I were to say it differently, what does it mean for me to inherit the museum as it is today? Because I've inherited, and if any of you work in museums, you will know that one of the hot potato, I don't know if you do that in Dutch, but the hot potato issues in museum where I theoretically, I also call it the Shaggy syndrome. Are you old enough to know Shaggy, the musician? Which is the most famous song, Shaggy song, that everybody knows? It wasn't me. It is the it wasn't me syndrome. And every curator says, it wasn't me. No, I didn't do it. I didn't do it. No. Hot potato. Human remains is like that. Every time human ancestors get discussed, especially in ethnographic museum, we want to throw it to the other curator because it's their fault, or to somebody else. So how do we contend with this terrible inheritance that we have in the present, that we were not necessarily a part of creating, but we are definitely a part of either their continuance or their undoing? And so he was interested in that. And for Rothberg, his interest was in many different issues. So the book started with Trayvon Martin and that racializing violence, or George Floyd, and that racializing violence that continues to kill people in the US. And many people who will say on their Twitter, Facebook, I am Trayvon, to support Eva Trayvon or to support the system. So how do we inhabit that space? So just to introduce, I take this time, Dark Times, from one of the more recent books by Achille Mbembe, where he is also contending with the question of decolonization, primarily intellectually more concerned with Africa, but still where he tries to articulate that the relationship with the moments of decolonization in the present and questions around that, and the intellectual architecture that animates the racializing lives of Black people, for example, in the present. And what does that mean? So he enters into a conversation also in that book about questions of philosophy, Hegel, and others. My intellectual, and so a few things that I want to end with today. One, decolonization might be an impossibility. But that doesn't mean that you don't need to try. It is, as David Scott says, an irreparable evil. But it doesn't give you the free way to just simply say, okay, I'm not going to do anything. Rather, it says that you need to do something. There's work to be done. That's one that I want to leave us with. Two, I don't have any answers to what decolonization is. I don't even know what to do. It is a confounding question in the present. And to be able to attend to it, one probably needs to accept the fact that there is no 5-point plan for decolonization, and that in its ization, that term, ization, it is an ongoing work, a labor, something that one needs to do continually. That we probably have to move away from simple categories of bystanders and victims, bystanders, and perpetrators. But that does not relinquish our responsibility from thinking about how we are implicated in the ongoing colonial of this moment. And perhaps finally, when we leave today, I would like to suggest that in addition to the questions that many people associate with decolonization, which is more about diversity and inclusion, so we like to push the discussion to that. Are there enough people of color working or whatever? In addition to that, which is an important question to ask, decolonization requires of us an undoing and a redoing of the intellectual architecture that underbeds our institutions. Because to decolonize the museum might, if you were wanting to take it in its American tenure, to think of it around it in terms of abolitionism. That's one possibility. And abolitionism means very many things to many people. So you can abolish the institution. But to decolonize the museum means to contend with the fact that the coloniality of form is still inside the museum. And if I've ever learned anything from a wonderful friend and colleague, Ariela Zule, and this I probably am going to step on toes, I'm sorry for that, but it will happen anyway, that to decolonize institutions, we have to first decolonize, or at least as well decolonize, African studies, and what that means, museum studies, heritage studies, anthropology. It is the disciplinary configuration that is still colonial that sometimes pushes us to keep on holding on to colonial structures. So I can leave now because that's all I wanted to say. But I'll give you a few. So who can tell me now? That's the Toronto Museum. The building opened in 1926, 27. Actually, the building that came after the Colonial Museum that opened in Harlem in 1864, and it was unashamed. It was called the Colonial Museum. When it went to Amsterdam, it was also called the Colonial Museum Colonial Institute. And it was, as I say, intended as an institution to basically, if you want to make it really flat and critical, to basically show what we had in the colonies, whether or not it is the ethnos, people, or it is what we had to be able to exploit. So one of the funny things within the ethnographic museum that we don't look at in the Topo Museum is that we always think of it as an ethnographic museum, but in its beginnings, it was also a museum of trade. And by trade, if you look in the Topo Museum, one of the first collections that you see, meaning earliest, is actually that it also had minerals. Yes. So we had bauxite, gold, silver. We had a whole heap of wood samples because we also wanted to see what was exploitable. So it was embedded to the colonial ideology. And then, you know, Museum Volkenkunde, right there. Funnily enough, Museum Volkenkunde always imagines itself as being the intellectual museum in our museum world, that it was always connected with Leiden University for a long time. In a way, we need to nuance that. It is true, but Tropo Museum was also a laboratory. So that was a space where physical anthropology race biology was being studied in the Chopo Museum. It also had a lab to study samples and whatever. But this museum has always been more associated with the university. So you could say tied to intellectual ethnology and also to the development of anthropology in the Netherlands. And then I do this consciously, because this is the Africa Museum, and I don't know how much of you have heard about the discussions in the paper recently. So there is a lot of discussion in the paper about the future of the Africa Museum. And a part of that discussion is what's to do with this. And behind it is the, here behind is the building, another building where the exhibitions are, but this is the outside museum, right? Which itself had a different genealogy. It came out of the missionary collections. And therefore, what has always been exciting with thinking about the museum is that each one of them traces a different kind of intellectual genealogy and tells us something else, at least on my account, on the relationship between science, museums, and, for example, questions of missionary work, colonialism. So each one tells that differently. And then we have our fourth museum, which is World Museum in Rotterdam, which shares a similar genealogy more to Volkenkunde than to the others. And that museum, actually, funnily enough, you could suggest, and I can't say this too loud, I hope there are not too many people watching me, so I can't keep secrets, but you could say that museum, when it started, it had a kind of minderheid. No, but gevoel. Inferiority complex, because it felt that Leiden has one. There's one in Haarlem, we need to have one as well. So this competition, city competition, has always been there, and the museum has always been a part of that kind of conversation about which one, who has one. Now, critique of the ethnographic museum is not new. I've been involved in this kind of museum for 20 odd years. And the idea of criticism there is tons and tons of writing on this. And funnily enough, I was talking to some colleagues from Hamburg today, and I was thinking with them that I've been a part of so many conferences that is called the Future of the Ethnographic Museum. It is unbelievable. Every year there's another conference trying to understand our future, which is interesting about the question of temporality, thinking futurity, but also how that temporality of futures is always bound up in an institution that everybody thinks is so out of date, old-fashioned, and should close down. So we're always in that struggle. Now, the ethnographic museum then, and that is, you see the displays. Now, what have you heard about the ethnographic museums and the critique? Or museums in general? And I'm coming to you next. Mm-hmm. Yeah, first, second.
Oh, okay.
What kind of criticisms have you heard about the museum? Nothing?
You,
No.
I want to tell something.
Yeah, tell me.
I am a tutor at the Arts Academy in The Hague. I have to explain it, to contextualize it. And we had a question about if, also in relation to the discourse of Orlando Vasquez about decoloniality and owning and owing. And I mean, the museum is all about owning instead of owing. And yeah, that I can just drop that question.
All right, brilliant. I asked her a question and you come back with a question to me. Thank you. Funnily enough, you bring up something else that is exciting.
Yeah.
Because in the question of decolonization, there are different intellectual streams.
Yeah.
One intellectual stream is the Vasquezian, Mignolian stream, which deals with question of decoloniality, decolonial from out, especially thinking through Middle and South American questions of indigeneity.
Mhm.
And there is another tradition that is more embedded in decolonization, which is more embedded in that independence movement of the 1960s, if you want to call it that, in several places around the world, and is more embedded in the work of people like Fanon, Glissant, Césaire. And then there is the in-between those. So there is that overlap as well, right? So we're going to come back to that question about owning and owing.
But I was, for example, I come from Tervuren, from the town in Belgium. Where they
Yeah,
have
Tervuren,
the
yeah.
museum of Africa. So I followed up when they wanted to renovate the museum. So the question was, okay, do we keep it as an example of how we treated our colonial past, or do we remodel it? Anyway, that's what I
All right.
about the discussion, more direct answer.
We're going to come to that then, because I think that's one of the reasons why I say to you that the question of decolonization is a question that emerges in different places in different ways for different purposes. So if it's any museum that I'd never want to be director of, I should tell you, it's Tervuren. Because as a museum, because it is such a difficult museum to inhabit and work with in the present. If they give me the job, I'm not saying I won't take it, but I'm just saying that it would be a difficult one. But what I mean is that the critique of Tervuren emerged even before the rise in conversation around decolonization that has happened recently. So that's what I mean. I want to come back to that. Your critique. And by the way, you work in the arts?
Yeah, in the art.
All right. And I want to make one statement to come back to you.
Okay.
The problem of decolonization must contend with the fact that perhaps one of the most colonial spaces right now is contemporary art. That we imagine that the ethnographic museum is the cesspool of museum world, where boils and pussies are, and it is so terrible. But I want to suggest to you that the architecture of defining and dividing the world into the civilized and uncivilized world, the colonized and the colonizing world, is as much present in the art institutions as it is in the ethnographic. The ethnographic just has a lot of objects that we talk about a lot. But I want to suggest to you that art institutions are also a part of ordering the world we imagine and live in today. And that needs to also be contend with the question of decolonization.
Well, I'm a literature instead, and I think still we go along the same path, because decolonization, as you said, is a phenomenon that concerns all of us. And I think, to me, the big dilemma to solve, that we are still trying to solve in a way, is also what has been collected over there. So what we as visitors or whatsoever, what is represented as coming from Africa to a foreigner, so to speak. So the content of what is there. And strange enough, however, then this dilemma also, or this debate about that restitution, about giving back what has been collected. And back to the issue about forms and coloniality forms that you said, I think very often it's also a matter of, indeed, what has been kind of excluded or neglected. No? If I think along the line of African text or African literature, it's a bit the same discourse, like why we focus on a specific kind of canon, and something that is purely indigenous or local has been left aside or totally forgotten. So yeah, this is a bit, I think, the crucial debate that you put in way better words before.
No, but I think that importantly, it's perhaps what I'm going to try and get to at the end, that statement by Azule that decolonization cannot be confined to the museum as an institution. Otherwise, we solve very little, because it is operating at different levels. So the first time, in a certain sense, when decolonization as a category became important more recently was perhaps in 2012-13, when actually a Belgian scholar, Matthias Kota, I think his name was, introduced the term in a conference that he was having here, and he invited us to that. But for us as museum, the term itself became important when we were working in a collaborative project, an EU-wide project, and we invited a group of young students to be with us. And they, three of them, Hodan Barzami, Teresa Bout, and Simona Zefa, they created this group called Decolonised Museum. And we had invited them to be a part of a conversation with us in the museum. And the idea is that in a certain sense, it was something that they wanted to do because they were critical of the coloniality of the structure of the institution, but never had access to the institution to be able to do anything. And we went into this collaborative project, and in a way, they kind of had carte blanche, the possibility of critique, which was a very difficult thing because museums work with systems. We work with structures. We have these rules. One rule is a text board should only have this number of words on it, like 75 or so. We have rules about how objects should be placed on display. And so when they came in, they were basically saying, yeah, nice rules, but perhaps the rules themselves are part of the colonial structure. And so one of the difficulties we have was just inviting them to write text. And if a text is written in the museum, we would never, as museum people, write a text like that. No. Because that is too long. Nobody's going to read it. We have all sorts of ideas about what text is. And so when they came in, they said, yeah, but we want to write our own text and we don't want it to be edited. So we said, okay. And the text itself was, in Dutch, we say pittig. It was not easy text. It was feisty text. It was text that called out the institution and its coloniality, but it also literally called out us as institution as being racist or ableist. One of the most teachable texts that we had was when one of the persons pointed out that if I am a person disabled by your building, then the only way for me to get there is to go into the goederen lift. Mm-hmm. And for us, that was, whoa, okay. We didn't think of that. We were thinking that the goederen lift was a nice way to give you access, but not thinking about what that means. What are we saying personally? So in a certain sense, they wanted the opportunity to be able to critique that. And that was one. And it was, to be honest with you, one of the most difficult periods. I mean, now is also difficult, but difficult periods in relationship to our museum work because there was no easy answer. And so we say, go ahead, the texts were written. It was quite critical of what we did, but it was also a teachable moment. And one of the things that I found very teachable was when we had the final conference and we had decided that they wanted it to be, no, I thought we were going to do it like this without the owl, because this owl thing also gives me stress. And they thought, yes, you can want to have it in a small room, but we want to actually have our space to Twitter. And so there was somebody who was tweeting all the time, and there were comments and criticisms coming in. And to be honest with you, inside the museum, that was really anxiety creating. And that was 2016, so it was still new for us. But we had considered a lot that we were going to have a counter Twitter. So when they tweeted something, we were going to say, but, and eventually we decided not to do it. And it meant that the institution could change some. And to be honest with you, I don't know, I can't tell you that the institution has changed a lot because we're still struggling with some of the questions that were raised. But it meant that we had to deal with that discomfort to be able to confront ourselves as institutions in what we are doing. And so that is one of the next things that I'd like to leave. And I don't know that there is anything easy about that, but academia, as well as museums, are so comfortable with being comfortable. We know in the academia that we can do our courses, we can write it up, we can teach it, the students are going to criticize it to death, give you bad grades, but that is all right, we'll teach it next year anyway. But the constancy of critique that has emerged recently around how we as academics work is something that we're not comfortable with. Still, we're still struggling with it. Students telling me that that survey course of art history that I teach is useless. But I've been teaching it now for 20 years, and I need to know the difference. Or that I'm reading a philosophy course and there is no person of color or woman in the syllabus.
No.
Or this is my favorite one, that we speak of the French Revolution and what it brought to us in terms of freedom, brotherhood and liberty. But the Haitian Revolution that came in the same moment is never spoken about. And the unfreedom that was a part of that is not a part of how we think as well. So when students started to ask that, we get uncomfortable and we don't know what to do. But in a certain sense, what the decolonization question has raised personally, and these are all slides with what we've been doing as an institution to try and do things differently. But what the decolonization question has raised for me is to think not decolonization in relationship to colonialism in its narrow form. So some people in my museum world tell me that, but we didn't colonize anybody. Mm. Or colonialism ended a long time ago. Or why would we think about colonization in a place like Jamaica that was the colonized and not colonizer? Or what does colonization have to do with Asian studies? And one of the things that, so after this 2015 moment, there were many decolonial movements. There were one in Germany, arising Berlin Decolonial, for example. But there's this beautiful movement that had emerged in the US, in New York, and it was called Decolonize This Place. And it was mostly attendant to the Museum of Natural History in New York. And I can see it on your face. There was a face there which says, oh my God, that place. That's the place.
No, I'm thinking about the Natural History Museum in Leiden.
Oh, in Leiden, okay.
Maybe also
one of the things that I don't do is that I don't do that, not getting there. But one of the interesting things with that movement emerged is that decolonization for them is a capacious term that includes thinking about how inequalities continue to be structured in our society that are sometimes based on questions of race, gender, sexuality. So when decolonization, when they try to work with the Brooklyn Museum or the American Museum of Natural History, one of the things they were talking about was questions of gentrification, or questions of who owns the land on which the museum is now sitting, or questions of gender and sexuality and equality and gender diversity. Because for them, like for the decolonial group that was with us in our museum, coloniality has bequeathed to us a complex terrain in the present where structural and systemic inequality are still what animates our institutional and epistemological frames. And they demand that we think about what that might look like. So when they ask the question, and the Ethnographic Museum is an interesting place from which to think decoloniality, because if you understand the genealogy of an ethnographic museum, it is based in what Tony Bennett has described as in his book, Birth of a Museum, as the museums embedded in what he calls the progressive taxonomy of man, with European man somehow, and I say man, for a good reason. I mean, if you read Sylvia Winter, there's a reason why I also say man. at the top, and then there is a rank order that goes down. And in the ethnographic museums, like the Great Exhibition, Colonial Exhibition, many different forms of difference from man who are present. That's why we get involved in questions of freak shows and human zoos. And anybody who doesn't look like that man becomes a site for such radical differencing that they were regarded as conscripted into this hierarchy of the human. And when you go in the US, it's a little different than here. So I understand what you mean by naturalis, but one of the things that I didn't say to you is that when the Tropical Museum started, it started with a collection from Harlem, and then it had the collection from the zoo artists, because artists also had a animal, then the evolutionary animal, which was Africa, Oceania, and the Americas. So we had those collections from this. And in the US, the Natural History Museum, the site where Franz Boas worked, or Margaret Mead worked, is also the site where science, animal, whatever, plants, whatever, and Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, and Asia is in that. So you see that also in the structure. A different in certain ways, but not as different as we think it is. We're saying that there was a history there as well. So it is because of that history that I suggest that to decolonize is to go back to that epistemic, that intellectual history that we have, to try and understand how the museum has been a form of ordering society. Because I tell it, and many people will disagree with me, if you were to look at how museums are organized, there is for a long time, and every time we talk about contemporary art, we go back to 1989 and Magician de la Terre as that moment when contemporary art became global and we included people from whatever. But if you look at the ordering of society, including the university, we have a museum for those people, the ones who were colonized mostly, that has been fundamentally embedded in the language of the primitive, the atemporal, the out of times. And then we have the other museum that do the other things: art, design, fashion, the museums of the man, the civilized. And the museum continue to structure that narrative of separating the world, of ordering the world. And one of the nice, interesting things with contemporary art is its idea, is how we, I was trying to work with an artist recently, and they say, I don't want to be in the ethnographic museum, I want to be in the Stedelijk. So artists are also conscripted to the idea that that is the museum for the civilized. Not that I don't like art, I love it, but I'm just saying. So I'm interested then to think decolonization as exactly that conceptual infrastructure that continues to order our world. And if I were to do it, make it very, very flat, anthropology itself has not long enough had an anthropology of Europe growing, but had not long enough, because that discipline it had other history. And when I went to the Horniman, when I worked in the Horniman in 2008 to 10, and somebody said to me, literally, she said, but you can't be an anthropologist because you work on Europe. Oh. You need to be a sociologist because that's what sociologists do. Anthropologists work on those people. So still there, that stubborn, a hard nefes, that's what you say, that stubbornness of the disciplinary thinking. But I want to suggest that that is not anyway on the if we look at our own university here in Leiden, one might have to decolonize area studies. What area studies mean? What areas are in area studies? Decolonize development studies and where development goes to study and what is studied in development. Decolonize world literature that still has world somewhere else than this world. And that's what I mean by the intellectual infrastructure that continues to hold us in bear as institutions like the museum. So, what do you study?
African studies.
Oh, yes. And you? Archaeology. Now, it's beautiful, eh? Because in our museums, funnily enough, we are an ethnographic museum with perhaps the smallest group of people who work there are ethnographers. Because most of us in the museum are historians, archaeologists, art historians, and probably less anthropologists than people think. And so I always think of Volkerkunde as also a capacious term that means more than one thing. But I was in a lovely discussion in Berlin, and I'm ending here so we can have a conversation. In a lovely conversation in Berlin, and we were talking about decolonization. And it was a really lovely conversation about decolonization. We're going on really nice, and then a student put up her hand, and she said, archaeology student, and she said to me, "But if we give them back, I won't be able to see them." And I thought that was just so beautiful. So that was my two main moments. When somebody said to me, "Can you give me a 10-point plan for decolonization?" I thought, yes, I'm going to do well if I do that. And the second one is, I can't see them. And it comes back to your question. Because in the coloniality of form, one of the tenacious things about the colonial is the idea that others must be available to us. They must always be available to us. Their objects must be available to us so that we can see them. But our objects not to them. But if you were to take it down, and I learned this from one of our good friend and colleague, Gassan Ash, if you take it to its limits, the idea that enslaved labor must be available to you, but that women's bodies must also be available to us in colonialism and slavery. That availability idea. And so one of the questions, and I would say that that wave of different modes and movements of decolonization that has been happening now for 30 odd years, perhaps from when people in the Pacific critiqued an exhibition that was going to be at I think it was at the Met, an exhibition on Oceania at the Met in the 1980s already, or that primitivism exhibition that was in New York. So from that moment, those criticisms are going on. And perhaps right now, where we are in the question of decolonization is the question of ownership. And who owns all of these objects that were taken at some point or another during colonialism. And to be honest with you, as a museum person, I can tell you that when that discussion happens, you feel weak in your stomach. It's like with the students and decolonization, you feel a little fear. Many museum people, no, not so much, but previously, every time that came up, you would say something like, "Oh, but my friend, I have a friend, and that friend tells me that they don't want the objects back." And so that kind of anxiety that the museum is going to be empty and it won't be available is a part of the current moment. For us, it is not so, because I mean, we are, first of all, I don't believe that the museum will be empty. For one of the reasons, to be honest with you, there are many people in museum studies who write nice books and it's so really wonderful about how museums work, if you read Tony Bennett, then you read that. Tony Bennett, because it is so Foucauldian, all is power and all is order, and you feel that everything is just so structured. When you work in a museum, you know that we are more useless than that. We do a lot of stupid things. We collect it. So, yeah, I invite you as a student for an internship. You came in. This is a real story. It's not about this museum, but another museum I work in. You came in. I was concerned that the objects were not properly documented. You put a number on it to document it. I submit that list to my board. And it is near impossible for me to get your water bottle from the museum anymore, because it has to go through a serious process of deaccession. I was in one museum where somebody made the mistake of putting a number on a light bulb. A light bulb. That also has to go to the board for deaccession. So it is a little bit more sloppy, like all of us intellectually are. I think so anyway. I find speculative intellectual work exciting. And it's not as ordered, like when we teach and we think that we're going to be prepared, we're never really prepared as much as we think, and we are overwhelmed by it. But the question so one of the things that comes out, especially in our society right now, when it comes to questions of restitution and return and decolonization, is this useless conversation that we have, and you hear my position here on identity politics. And we reduce identity politics, not as it is understood in its emergence from Black feminism, but we use it just to simply cut people down and say that they shouldn't talk because it's all about identity and whatever.
I don't get it. Can you explain what you mean?
Identity politics.
No, but that is related to identity politics.
Yeah, because people say that when you talk about decolonization and you talk about colonialism and you talk about equity in who works in the institution, that has nothing to do with quality. It has to do with identity politics. So it is only identity politics that's going on. Or you talk about restitution, people reduce it to that. And at the end of the day, I think identity politics in its genealogy coming out, the one I know anyway, from Black feminist thinking, is actually an important way of understanding how to move towards questions of equity. So in that sense, it is also about equity. But fundamentally, and this is where I will definitely start, decolonization is about, for me, for us, not just about questions of recognition, identity, but it's a redistributive politics. It is a politics of redistributing not only power, but also the right to decide over who owns, what is owned, what ownership means, what ownership looks like, but also within what intellectual categories are we going to speak, think, use objects. When you, as an archaeologist, graduates or undergraduates are ready, you're going to dig something up, probably not what you want to do, you bring it back to my museum, and I have the category of human remains that I put it in. And the indigenous person that I work with says, oh, that is my ancestor. So the category there is human ancestor, not human remains, but human ancestor. Or when I say that this, and I'm just making this, this is a water bottle. And the indigenous person says to me, but that's not a water bottle. That water bottle has personhood. It is a person. Or and this is also a true story, I go to a masquerade tradition and I buy an object, a dance mask from a masquerade tradition, and I pay them to take the object out of its use cycle. literally said, stop the ritual right now, I want that object. And I put it in the museum, and then the community goes into chaos. Because for them, the object was supposed to be destroyed and let the spirits free. How do we think to redistribute the right to be able to do that? And if any dream that I have, because I believe in the ethnographic museum, even after I've been so negative. And I truly believe in the ethnographic museum as an urgent museum in the present. I believe in the word world, in world museum and world culture museum as well. Because I believe that if anything these museums can do, need to do, and I say this over and over, so many people might be bored to hear it, is that they are able to say to us here in Europe that we are no longer the center of the world, nor were we ever. That intellectually, there are many possible worlds that are important for us to contend with in living our humanity together with non-human animals and things. And I think that that story is still urgent to be told. That we are only a province in the pluriverse of knowledge and being that is in the world. And the Ethnographic Museum has a special place to be able to tell that story, I think. And my final word is this. Perhaps the redistributive justice of the ethnographic will only be decolonized, not when all objects move back, but when, if I, as a museum director, want to do an exhibition on Africa and African art, I can also ask people in Africa for loans and not just the Cape Brown Lee or the British Museum because they have the objects. And that we understand the ways in which visa regimes are today, that says to me that every person, almost every country in Africa needs a visa to come here to see exhibitions. Whereas most of us can travel just like that anywhere, and we can ask for the visa right at the airport and we get it, including our relationship with Indonesia. That is decolonization, to realize that the infrastructure of travel alone is a part of the coloniality of the present. And I would even suggest that while I know that I can go to Caracas and I can see a really nice exhibition on, I think, Pizarro, Picasso, whomever, because they have that collection there, I would like to see a survey show on Gauguin or on Picasso or on Mondrian in Nigeria and not in Amsterdam, because they also have those collections there. That for me is the redistributive politics of decolonization, and where the horizon of hope is for a future that might be much more equitable in terms of heritage politics and heritage futures. And even if we achieve that, the museum would still not be able to be decolonized, because we will be still struggling with other coloniality of forms, racialization, gender and sexual inequalities that continue to animate our perspectives today. The Maroons in Jamaica have a different understanding, if I understand it well, of ownership. Their ownership is not based on possessive individualism. Their ownership is based on use. So if you use the land, then you own it until the time you stop using the land, and then somebody else uses the land. It is about commons, a commonality of ownership, a shared ownership. Perhaps we could imagine that kind of ownership in the future, one of the things that I've been thinking about is what would happen if somebody were to squat the British Museum? Another kind of ownership difference. But anyway, that's what I had to say to you today. And if you have questions, comments, and you know, I can talk forever. So you know.